DD103. Investigating the social world. The next few pages are very, very important for a first assignment. We're going to compare and contrast a few different sociological scientists, researchers. Page 14, I'm going to start from. A debate often leads to social scientists asking questions about how far inequality should be considered acceptable, and if some degree of inequality is considered acceptable or inevitable. Some kinds of inequality may be distributed than others, whereas other kinds of inequality may be commonly understood as priorities to address for the sake of social order. For example, the United Nations Children Fund, the UNICEF, has stated that countries should place the well-being of children at the top of their responses to the recession. Not only is this a moral obligation, but it is a self-interest of societies. UNICEF. Make a note of your thoughts in response to the following questions. Can you think of different examples of how inequalities have developed or changed in different situations? Whether at home, work, or in international politics, for instance. You may have considered inequality in relation to gender. Absolutely. Such as inequalities between men and women in the workplace, and how aspects of these have changed over years. For example, 50 years ago in the UK, it's commonly accepted that marriage, a woman would give up paid work to dedicate herself to domestic work. As commonly held views on gender equality and choice for women have changed during this period. It is now quite common for married women to maintain a role in paid employment. However, debates over equal pay for men and women in the workplace have persisted over this period, such as a reduced mobility of elderly people in their homes compared to when they were younger. Perhaps certain life changes prompted examples such as a promotion at work, the arrival of a new baby, retirement, or migration to a different country. Money and equality. Changes morale, doesn't it? Changes principles around the workplace as well. Inequalities and money. The social science investigation of inequalities starts by asking questions based on what, when, and where. How and how much, such as what causes gender equalities, or how do wealth inequalities change over time. In attempting to address these questions, social scientists look for different sorts of evidence. The different sorts of evidence the social scientists use, and the consideration of different sorts of evidence in addressing such questions is something that will be looked at in more details later on this block. To start with though, it is useful to focus on the use of questions and evidence as a starting point for social science investigation. Questions are used by social scientists to try to find information that they can organise and use to develop, understand the social world. Evidence. Evidence is sought and used by the social scientists to help them understand and explain the social world. Different sorts of evidence used to weigh up how particular arguments and claims appear to hold true. Before we can start to develop some questions, it will be useful to think a little more about money in relation to inequality and to consider the questions already being asked of the relationship between them. Coins and banknotes as representing money. are almost meaningless objects. The value of things they can be exchanged for is usually much greater than the materials from which they are made. Controversially, a pound sterling cannot be exchanged for a pound in weight of gold. However, what one might call its worth has different meanings and moral values based on the cultural and social factors. People might attach different judgments to other people based on how they acquire or how they spend their money. For example, somebody drawing a state, somebody's drawing a state pension, be reviewed, be viewed differently in society from a person receiving unemployment benefit, despite the fact that their incomes are both paid from state funds. In this sense, then, we also need to ask the questions about what money means within a society. Michael Sandel, 2014, expressed concerns about the rapid changes in the role and the meaning of money and the increasing commodification of many areas of our lives. Or, to put it another way, the increasing tendency to put a price on things. Scandal is concerned about a drift towards a market society where almost anything's up for sale and where even people's bodies and health can be commodified for advertising or experiments. He argues that the significant health and safety risks of such moves means that poor people would be more vulnerable to selling their bodies in such ways to acquire money, perhaps to pay for their studies or for the basic needs. Another example he gives concerns the use of private personnel rather than use of military personnel to fight in Afghanistan. This may mean that the poorest of the society take risks and become dispensable commodities. If money is to change a social practice and significantly, he argues society risks losing many fundamental shared values for Sandel. These changes are causing an intensification of inequality, which is allowed to continue will create a danger of society becoming increasingly and more significantly divided. Scandal claims that inequality is pushed beyond certain limits. It threatens a good life for everybody in a society that inequalities are many in many ways having significant impacts on their social lives. This is this is one particular social science argument about the relationship between money and equality. Next time we'll look at two further social science arguments about money and inequality, showing how different social science arguments can help us to further investigate the social world through the lens of inequality. You can see when people do have a bit of crisis and need to get their bills paid, they do put their life at risk. Like you get sex workers selling their body for sex, you get drug dealers. Um, all they're doing is trying to make a bit of put bread and butter on a table for their family. They put their own life at risk just to make a crust. It's a true story. Saskia Assassin. While the analysis of inequality is commonly concerned the areas of exclusion and those who are excluded, social scientists Saskia Sassin who used the term expulsion to convoy the inequalities created through the spectral displacement of people, which she argues are significantly insufficiently captured through standard categories such as inequality and poverty. Sassan 2016. The term expulsion has often been used in relation to the expulsion of people from their area of land to make way for developments such as logging enterprises or for factory, road or dam building projects. Also, as particular crops becoming increasingly valued on global markets, people can experience expulsion to make a way for plantations for crops such as oil palms. Expulsion can be seen in relation to the building of luxury accommodation, developments in previously poor areas of cities, as has occurred in areas of London, for example, Stafford prior to 2012 Olympic Games, or in London's Docklands during 1980s and 90s. However, Sassin argues that we'll be witnessing a wider process even beyond the more obvious forms of expulsion, whereby land acquisition by large international firms and wealthy foreign countries threatens the authorities of poorer nations. Sassan. Page 17. This is important, these two pages, 16 and 17. Investigating money, introducing the theme of inequality. Ulrich Beck, the German social scientist. Ulrich Beck has argued that neither class or nationality and a great of significance in understanding equality in a contemporary world, where person groups populations across a nation, state boundaries, and significantly affected their situation and life opportunities by the consequence of decisions and structures of others. Beck, 2007. The decisions and the structures that Beck refers to relate to particularly inequalities associated with risk, whereby the more powerful and the rich society were able to buy their way out of risky environments, as the risks associated with activities such as industrial production sites are moved to other parts of society and often other parts of the world. The inequalities are the risk accentuated. One such example would be exporting of toxic materials, including nuclear and chemical byproducts, for the rich. The enormous risks associated with economic production are translated into acceptable costs. Smith, 2013. Whereas poor people have no choice and potentially not even necessary knowledge to protect themselves from the risks to their wealth and livelihoods. Page 18 to 19. What questions about money might we ask to better understand inequalities highlighted in these arguments? What evidence can we identify from these arguments about the role of money and the nature of inequalities? In all three of these social arguments outlined above, those Sandel, Sassin and Beck, we see that inequalities are highlighted in slightly different ways, but with a common thread around the relationship between money and inequality. For Sandel arises increasing commodification of aspects of social life, which creates a situation where poor become more vulnerable through a greater need to realise the monetary value of things, such as their own bodies. Sassen's observation is similar, but at the scale of the land grabbing across geographical and political borders, where it is national sovereignty which becomes a sacrifice to financial gain. For Beck, the story is slightly different in that it is not about selling of personal or national interest, but about they already have financial dominance, using it to secure themselves against environmental risks, such as pollution, which are in turn transferred to the poor. Across all of these examples, it seems that inequality is created through a process of buying and selling. So the kind of questions we want to ask about money might include: what is the relationship between money and authority? Is it possible to put a price on the risk avoidance? Does financial commodification lead to social divisions? Each of the three arguments draw a range of evidence. Although the examples are lightly touched upon here, the texts themselves provide a great deal of detail and explanation to demonstrate their individual the financial involving the purchase by governments and private companies. For Beck's evidence comes an example of environmental case studies as in nuclear accidents in or industrial chemical pollution incidents. Hello, hopefully it's working. Looking at conclusion, the section has introduced you to the following key learning areas and skills. The topic of money is meaning, value, and global influence in making the world go round, as well as its significance as it uses social science study. The theme of inequality, it is different forms and the ways it may be understood as a module theme, providing a lens for viewing and interpreting the social world from a particular perspective, social science investigation, and the role of questions and evidence to finding out more about the relationship between money and inequality. On page 20, investigating the social world, module DD103. I don't know if anyone's following the textbook in the module. It's just I'm reading it out as a audio book, so people that don't acknowledge things when they read, they can listen in, maybe do a bit of artwork and do something therapeutic. You might sink in a bit. Money as debt, introducing the theme of rights. In this section, we turn to money in a form of debt. To help think about that, we consider the development and growth of the city Guangzhou in China. The second module is theme and might as well be introduced here also, and the connection between the topic of debt and the theme of the rights will be considered. In Guangzhou is one of the most polluted populations in the world. And the connection between the topic of debt, rights provides us with the lens through which we consider the social world. In relation to debt, this raises a series of questions about, for example, the right to pursue economic growth or the right to maintain access to clean air in the environment where there is rapid industrial growth. We will consider the ways debt is used and the ways it is valued, as well as how debt connects with the theme of rights through ideas such as entitlement and protection. As before, questions such as these will be considered alongside the evidence and examples used to try and find out more about this relationship in the context of social science investigation. Why study debt? In previous section, consideration was given to the meaning of money, and concerns about its effects were highlighted through different social science arguments, particularly in terms of inequality. Inequality bears a relationship to debt. 2. Since some people may have little choice but to borrow money and struggle to avoid amassing debt, while others are able to amass personal fortune. Paul McCartney, who was 1964, suggested that money can't buy me love. Had a personal fortune over 700 million by 2014, Aldridge 2015. On the other hand, according to the Tuck, cited in Milligan 2017, the average household debt in the UK in 2016 was £12,887, excluding debt from mortgages. While saving money, be it to pay off debts, building up for a rainy day fund, or paying into a pension scheme, is usually regarded as virtuous. Being in debt has many bad associations. Nevertheless, the business world is driven by debt. Companies expect to finance their purchase of raw materials, as well as their investments of plant and equipment. And when people borrow money through mortgages to buy houses, etc., to live in, it is usually regarded as a good financial plan. As we have seen, the meaning of money is varied and dependent on people's values. This is true of goods and lifestyles, to whether or some it's considered a necessity or not affects how good or bad. The debt used to acquire is judged to help think about both the positive and negative connotations of debt, and in more detail it is useful to explore a specific example which helps to illustrate these considerations. This is what social scientists call a case study. Here we look at the city of Guangzhou. The story of Guangzhou, according to the International Monetary Fund (IMF), the criteria. China's economy is the largest of the world. IMF 2015, indeed by 2010, it has become a world power politically, militarily and economically, and was increasingly viewed as a rival of the US back in 2012. The city of Guangzhou in China has been hailed an up-and-coming metropolis potentially rivaling Beijing and Shanghai at a centre of business and culture. It is China's fourth largest city and has been described in travel guides as an appealing mix of retail frenzy and capitalist energy, tempered by the ancient traditions and in fact historical distincts. Guangzhou is capital to Masu and Hong Kong. Once a leader in tea production, the city now boasts a skyline of huge skyscrapers and it hosts to a variety of businesses and trade industries. A few more. The growth of Guangzhou provides an interesting case study for social science investigation. The rapid development of the city can be linked to the general growth of the global economy, or more concerned plan on the part of the Chinese government to stimulate high levels of local and regional consumer spending with China. For combination 2, Guangzhou is competing for development with either Chinese cities or city regions, as well as with comparable cities in other countries. It must also cooperate as well as compare in order to obtain central government funds, central contracts and participate in national projects. In addition to this is a deal with pressure to finance more from its own borrowing or taxation. Guangzhou's debt does produce a range of social challenges, however, presenting debt as an entire negative in its context may be misleading borrowing and enabling the city to fund urban infrastructure such as roads, housing and sanitation. And this in turn has supported new enterprise investing there. The investments have drawn large numbers of the rural migrants into the city, thereby improving their livelihoods through their high incomes. In turn, the city benefits from increasing tax income to the service debt and further invest and grow. Guangzhou grow to also increase China's growth, with money remitted to Chinese rural economies while promoting global investment and trade. It could also be argued that livelihoods around the world are boosted throughout the availability of cheap consumer goods, and thus the debt can be seen as making the world go round. The building of debt by Guangzhou, and indeed by other cities, regions and national governments, in relation to this has to raising money for or borrowing from citizens, raising questions about rights. This in turn raises questions about different claims or the rights be able to make different peoples and groups and how they may concern into conflict with one another. The theme of rights. Rights encompasses a range of ideas about relating to how freedoms, protection and benefits are organised and distributed. Some forms of rights may be seen as conditional upon certain responsibilities such as paying one's taxes, while they are held to be unconditional, such as those upheld in Universal Declaration of Human Rights (UDHR), agreed upon by members of the United Nations and after the Second World War, which intend to guarantee all humans a minimum standard rights, such as universal definitions, are open to challenge because of its difficult to define rights across different social and cultural contexts. Members of the United Nations agree to uphold these standards and can be subject to diplomatic pressure if they fail to do so. The statement below is drawn from the introductory statement preamble to UDHR. What practical difficulties do you think there might be in defining, implementing and or guaranteeing such a set of equal rights? Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, peace in the world. Minimum standard of rights. Such universal definitions are open to challenge because it is difficult to define rights across different social and cultural contexts. Members of the United Nations agree to uphold these standards and can be subject to diplomatic pressure if they fail to do so. The statement below, drawn up the introductory statement, preamble the UDR. Oh, you may have considered a number of difficulties here. These might link to example difficulties of defining terms such as freedom, justice, or even peace in a single, universal way. You might also consider the possibility that tensions can sometimes exist when we securing the freedom of one group of people might be to detriment of another group's freedom. The concept of freedom is itself contested, and arguably everybody's rights to freedom are to some extent constrained. Even 38, even when states considered to be among the most progressive in the world. Sweden, for example, yeah, does he want some? Is one of the most developed countries in the world and enjoys a high level of human development. It declares a right for citizens to be able to demonstrate, but even so, this may be restricted by law if, for example, it threatens national security. In many states concerned about national security are often highlighted to restricted rights, sometimes temporary, in response for a natural terrorist emergency, sometimes with longer term intentions such as government immigration policies. Furthermore, in the UN members are to have all equal rights of freedom. Different concerns about national security might be difficult to reconcile with equal rights. Interrelationships between different rights may also complicate the picture. For example, freedom could be argued to rely on a concern on a certain level. Last 2 pages for now. Of economic security, and indeed a number of UDR's 30 declaration known as articles do relate to this. For example, Article 21. Everyone as a member of society has the right to social security and the title to realisation of the economic, social and cultural rights indispensable for the dignity and free development of his personality. Article 23. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favourable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work. How effectively states implement economic rights such as these differs significantly. In the UK, many rights may have been associated with being able to freely consume and spend money. These economic rights might be largely achieved by citizens being able to affordably purchase many goods produced in a country such as India, Bangladesh, Turkey, or China, suggesting that workers in those countries have far from equal rights compared to the Western consumers. On the other hand, for Guanzago's residents, it improves social and economic security and access to work, at least when compared to rural conditions in parts of China, has been driven by these global market conditions, finally by financing through borrowing. The government of Guangzhou may be able to secure both its own rights as well as those of its citizens, even if such debts also bring risks. Growth and rights of Guangzhou. A significant challenge of social science research is many social process are about movement and change, and so require a protracted and detailed study in order to capture developmental patterns such as the impact of debt, population growth, and changes of livelihoods, the movement of people, as well as knowledge, goods, and environmental impacts associated with these movements. It's all important considerations when thinking about how these dynamic processes might impact upon rights. We'll now look at migration and land in Grand Zango's development to consider some of the evidence in China. The whole population is classified as belonging to one or two groups, urban or rural, under the hukou or household registration system. The system was implemented in 1958 to the administrative distribution of the state resource and control for urban mitigation. To Sang 2014, under the socialist system, people were given ration cards to buy food and goods and subscribe prices. Those people who were not resident in the place were held where they were held. Their cuckoo status were not entitled to access and rationing cards. Today, despite the growth of cities in the market-orientated reforms, as well as pressures from businesses and social activists, the system remains largely in place. Although people are much free to move, people and their children with no cuckoo in the place where they were live face enormous difficulties accessing jobs, education, healthcare, and welfare relief. Grand Zago's expansion highlights the scale of the challenge that poses for many migrant workers and their families into moving to the city, which nonetheless relies on movement of millions of rural migrants as well as workforce to support growth. The Guardian's Story of Cities series Sasala 2016 examined the city of Shenzhen and Grand Zago's neighbouring cities of the Pearl River Delta. It stated that the city's current 11 million residents, only a quarter hold urban identity cards, according to China's unknown system. Significantly, is also a figure which does not include undocumented workers. There you go. That is my reading done for today. Page 15 to page 26. Nice one, bro. Let's have a smoke.